Deputy Mark Turner was patrolling the mountain roads at midnight, snow whipping across his windshield like shards of glass. At his side, Thor, his loyal German shepherd, stiffened, ears pinned, growl low. Ahead, flames devoured an old cabin on the ridge. But what stopped Mark cold wasn't the fire. It was the muffled moan beneath the snow. Digging desperately with Thor's paws and his own hands, he unearthed a half-frozen homeless man clutching a weathered notebook against his chest. Inside lay secrets powerful enough to topple the most untouchable men in town. And with that discovery, Mark's quiet mountain patrol turned into a battle for truth, survival, and justice. Mountain Hollow wore winter like an old punishment. The town crouched in a high basin, ringed by black-shouldered pines and shale ridges, its street lamps casting weak amber halos that dissolved in the hard, horizontal snow. Wind bullied the clapboard storefronts on Main, an antique shop with faded bunting, a diner with a closed sign taped over the pie of the day board, a barber pole frozen mid-twirl. Above them all the water tower shivered, its white letters ghostly in the blizzard's breath, and beyond the last houses the mountains rose like sleeping animals under thick pelts of ice. The night had the raw, metallic taste of a storm that had arrived to settle a score. Patrol tires chewed through drifted lanes where plows had surrendered. Power flickered in waves across neighborhoods, one triangle of light dying as another stuttered to life. In the valley's throat, the river ran under pressed glass, seams of black water showing where current refused to freeze. It was close to midnight, and the world was narrowed to the reach of headlights and the animal courage to keep moving forward. Deputy Mark Turner kept moving forward. He drove the county SUV with both hands high on the wheel, shoulders squared inside a winter duty jacket that made a bulkier silhouette than his lean frame actually owned. 38, white, handsome only in the way weather carves lines into a man until the face becomes a map. He wore the kind of beard that began as laziness during elk season, and had stayed because it made strangers think twice. His hair was dark and clipped close over a widow's peak. His eyes were the blue of pond ice at dawn, and patient in the way of people who have learned to wait out fire. Before the badge, he had been a wildland firefighter, the kind who could read a ridgeline like a paragraph. A blow-up on the red mica burn 6 years back had taken 2 of his crew and left him with a skin-grafted forearm, a habit of listening longer than most men, and a private theology that favored duty over speech. Calm wasn't affectation with Mark. It was armor hammered in the old heat. Riding the rear compartment was Thor, his partner, and the town's argument-ending answer to whether a dog can look like purpose. A 6-year-old German shepherd, sable and black, 78 pounds of drive balanced on cat-quiet feet, Thor carried himself like a tool that knew it was sharp. One ear was nicked, a crescent scar from a wire fence on a summer track, and his amber eyes were steady, inquisitive, quick to soften with children and quicker to harden with men whose pulses told lies. He had the tight, athletic build of a working line dog. Clean croup, deep chest, coat thick under the winter vest. If you touched him, you'd feel heat and coiled spring. If you watched him, you'd see a mind that measured rooms. He was a search and rescue grad with cross-training in detection. A dog who found a missing 6-year-old in a blackberry thicket last June, and sat softly beside an elderly woman who died in her armchair with the TV still on. Thor loved snow the way some animals love water. He loved Mark with the single-channel loyalty that makes partnered work a kind of marriage. The radio was a sizzle of static tonight, the storm chewing the repeater on Elk Crest. When dispatch made it through, it came like a voice thrown across a canyon. Carla Diaz, early 30s, Latina, A single mom with a dry wit and nails painted in tiny constellations because her kid liked the stars. She had the cadence of someone who can sort chaos with vowels. Unit 3, status check. Mark thumbed the mic, eyes on the smear of road where lane lines vanished beneath rippled white. Unit 3, green. Snow's stacking faster than city promised. I'm on Ridge and Mill. If county loses power, I'll swing by the assisted living on my way back. Copy 3, heads up from state. Wind chill -30 on the overpasses. Oh, and I've got a citizen report of a transformer pop near the logging spur. Might just be the grid doing jazz. Keep your head down. Always do, Mark said, and Carla's snort carried a smile he couldn't see. He eased the SUV around a blown-in corner where cottonwoods hunched like old men in coats, the vehicle yawing once on ice and then catching with a grumble through four-wheel. The storm had gone past pretty hours ago. Now the snow came in granular sheets that stung the skin and found the seam under any collar. Now the gusts played low music in the SUV's mirror housings and lifted loose roofing like a magician's trick. Mark scanned by habit. The shadowed mouth of the alley behind Duffy's Hardware, the dark windows of Mill's Pharmacy, the hill beyond where old logging roads corkscrewed up into timber. Out there, sheds leaned, deer bedded, and men made quiet choices when they thought nobody watched. Thor stood, weight shifting to brace against motion, and placed both forepaws on the equipment box to peer through the side glass. He breathed a fog print, and then another. His ears pricked forward, swiveled, pricked again, telling Mark more than words that the night had grown interesting. "What do you have?" Mark asked without turning, voice conversational, as if asking a friend to pass the salt. Thor's answer was not a bark, but a tension that ran from withers to tail, a bass note rising in the chest the way a violin's low string hums before the bow. He lifted his head to the tiny window vent where a thin draft slipped, nose twitching in staccato, then cut his eyes to the right in a way that meant, "Take this seriously." Mark rolled down his window 2 inches. The air shoved in, ice-cold and flavored distinctly, with something that wasn't wood stove. It had that bitter, resinous edge, the smell of varnish and accelerant and old pine meeting sudden flame. He let the scent sit on his tongue a heartbeat, then tapped the turn signal even though no one would see it, because a man keeps his habits, in small things, so they'll be there when the big things come calling. The road to the logging spur rose in a white ramp. On a clear day, the ridge gave a view of the valley like a map. Tonight, it was a white curtain painted with vague shapes. The SUV's tires found ruts, climbed, slipped, climbed again. The wind took small grabs at the vehicle and shook it as if to test welds. Snow flew like sparks in the headlights. Real sparks joined them when Mark crested the saddle and saw it. An old hunting cabin on the east lip of the ridge, windows turned into mouths, flames licking out and tasting the blizzard as if insulted it was there. Firelight moved across the ground in fast animal ways, throwing and snatching shadows so that every stump looked like a figure pivoting. The roof had begun to fail. You could hear the damp, crunchy collapse as snow met ember and cedars popped like knuckles. For one instant, the scene read like a postcard of hell. Orange and white, heat and killing cold, the cabin a square of rage in a world of hush. Mark set the SUV on the shoulder where wind had scoured the cut banks down to crust, thumbed the hazard lights, and killed the engine. "Stay with me," he told Thor, which did not mean heel Velcro, but did mean we move as a pair now. Thor flowed down when the rear door opened, paws sinking to mid-cannon in powder, then kicking, then finding the compacted layer beneath. Snow dusted his muzzle. He shook once, a full-body snap that tossed ice crystals like a glittering halo, and then his head rose into the wind again, nostrils tasting. He glanced at the flames, dismissed them, and shifted his attention 10 degrees left of the obvious. That, too, was training. Never assume the loud thing is the important thing. Mark zipped his hood, pulled his glove with the peeled-back index finger tighter, and started across the sloped clearing, boots crunching where old drifts had hardened and sinking where new snow had swallowed the depressions. Heat slapped his exposed skin near the cabin, and then was gone in the next gust. The sensation like stepping through a door he couldn't see. He tried his radio. The blizzard ate it. He clipped it back and set his stride to something you can hold for hours. A spray of sparks arced up and vanished. The fire's voice changed key as the wind gulped it and gave it back. He circled wide by instinct, because you never walk straight into a thing you don't understand, and because light seduces the eye when darkness is where trouble waits. Thor's tail had gone flat and straight, not tucked, just an arrow drawn taut. The dog moved with that peculiar head-low trot that his scent work made visible, an S-curve through air and over ground, sampling eddies, interrogating them, discarding, re-choosing. Twice he paused and put his nose to snow until the bridge of it turned white. Then he backed out, sneezed sharply, and adjusted his line. Mark let him lead, but not own the scene. His own eyes maintained their sweep, timberline shadows, the fence half buried in drifts, the road cut where a vehicle could crouch. He saw drag marks before he named them, 2 long grooves parallel as rails, spaced just so, filled in places where the wind had drifted but still present, the way a sentence remains even when you smudge the ink. Between them, the faintest freckles of darker snow where something liquid had spattered and then frozen a shade duller than the white around it. The world tightened to a seam. Mark knelt, gloved fingers brushing, the leather squeaking faintly. He touched the divot where a heel had kicked weakly, the shallow trough where weight had been pulled, not carried. "Got activity," he said, though no one heard him except the dog and the night. Thor's hackles lifted in a ripple too small to see unless you knew the dog intimately. Mark did. The shepherd turned his head into the wind, then cut left, threading between 2 fence posts that had acquired snow hats, and in 3 leaps reached the lee of a drift that had built where the ground dipped. There the wind softened, and the storm's voice lowered, and in that small hush, Thor froze, right forepaw lifting, the classic point of a dog bred to find what is hidden. Mark's breath came out as steam that hung around his face. He stepped to Thor's shoulder and let his eyes travel not to the flames, but to the drift itself, which wore the humped shape of a dune. The dog's ears went back, forward, back again, like instruments fine-tuning. He leaned in and pressed his nose to the snow. For a second, it was only the hiss of falling ice against his hood, and the random pops of the cabin's bones giving way. Then, from under the snow at their feet, a sound answered. A ragged, human noise, so thin and unbelieving it could have been the wind if the wind had learned to plead. It wasn't words. It was the smallest syllable of pain a man can make when he has used up all the bigger ones and still isn't ready to surrender. Mark's spine locked as if something had tugged a cable. Thor's throat gave a low, anchoring rumble, not alarm, not complaint, an affirmation that he too had heard. Mark crouched lower, gloved palm flattening to feel for vibration through the crust. The cold bit through leather into scar tissue, a fast, needling ache. He tuned his breath to silence his own body, and the noise came again. Closer to a moan now, fluttering and lost, the voice of a person packed into earth. Firelight swung and painted the drift in quick oranges. Snow slid off the crest with a sound like paper. Mark set his jaw. The cabin behind them roared. The world in front of them whispered. And under the white, A man was alive. He reached for his shovel instinctively and found none. He had not planned for burial, only for roads and welfare checks and the usual midnight agreements with Winter. He looked at his hands, at the dog, at the drift where a life sounded no bigger than a moth. "I hear you," Mark said, softly enough that the wind couldn't steal it. "Hold on." Thor nosed the drift as if to answer, set his forepaws firm, and stared at Mark with pupils that had gone wide until the amber was a ring around black. Mark's lips thinned. Not fear, not yet, but the tight line of a man counting seconds. He drew a breath that tasted of smoke and iron, and the night waited with him. The moan came once more, fragile and final as a promise. And there the chapter ends, with snow falling, flames chewing the old cabin's ribs, and under a drift at Mark Turner's boots, a stranger's breath refusing to quit. Mark's gloves tore into the drift, the icy crust biting through leather, knuckles aching as he shoveled snow with the desperation of someone prying a secret from the earth. Thor lunged beside him, paws a blur, muscles working in tense, efficient bursts. Snow fountained upward, scattering into the gale and blowing sideways across the firelight from the burning cabin. The heat at their backs and the suffocating cold in front twisted the moment into a nightmare painting. Flames roaring while a human life whispered faintly under ice. Mark's breath plumed white, filling the air around his face with clouds that rose and vanished as quickly as his hope flickered. He muttered encouragements, half to himself, half to the dog. "That's it, Thor. Keep at it. Hang on, whoever you are." His chest throbbed with adrenaline, lungs raw from the bitter air, but he refused to pause. When his gloved hands finally brushed something solid that was not stone, not root, he froze. His fingers moved again, brushing snow aside, uncovering fabric so stiff with ice it cracked. He pulled harder, dislodging clumps of white until a shoulder appeared, then the slope of a neck, then a head, features entombed in frost. The body was heavy with snow, yet disturbingly light when freed, as though life had already drained away. Mark pressed his ear near the frozen face and felt a whisper of breath ghost against his cheek. He sucked in air as if he had been holding it all along. "Alive," he rasped, voice carried off by the wind. The man they unearthed was in his 50s, though time and hardship had aged him closer to 70. His face was long, edges carved by years of exposure, beard grown wild in uneven tufts now frosted white, clinging to his cheeks and throat like moss on rock. His nose was narrow, bent slightly at the bridge as if broken in some forgotten fight. Deep grooves bracketed his mouth, not from laughter but from years of clenching against cold and hunger. His skin, where it wasn't blue from cold, was weather-worn, the leathered tan of someone who had lived more seasons outside than under a roof. His hair, long and matted, streaked with gray, plastered to his scalp in frozen ropes. His body told the same story. A man built with broad bones, once strong, now whittled by years of starvation into angles and shadows. His clothing was an assortment of cast-offs, a military surplus coat so worn the camouflage had bled to dull gray, trousers patched with cloth of mismatched colors, and boots with soles peeling like old bark. His gloves were fingerless, little more than rags tied around his hands, and beneath his coat, Mark glimpsed layers of sweaters and shirts that belonged to different decades. Around his waist, a belt of frayed rope held it all together. And still, somehow, clutched against his chest in hands stiff and white from frostbite, was a notebook. Its leather cover was cracked, the spine swollen with damp. It looked like a relic from another century. Yet the way the man held it, knuckles locked, nails torn from gripping too tightly, spoke of treasure, not trash. Mark had to pry gently, easing the fingers apart, murmuring as if the man could hear. The notebook slipped free for a moment, pages warped and edges frozen, before Mark slid it back into the folds of the man's coat. "We'll keep it safe," he said. "Just breathe." Thor whined, circling once, ears pivoting to the forest beyond. The shepherd pressed close, his body a barrier against the storm, warm breath steaming against the stranger's cheek. His amber eyes flicked to Mark, then back to the tree line, then down to the man again. The dog's entire body vibrated with urgency, as if he understood the balance between life and death had become delicate as blown glass. Mark stripped off his parka, teeth clenched against the bite of wind against his own body, and wrapped it tight around the man. The fabric looked enormous on the frail frame, but gave the only insulation Mark could offer. He slid his arms under the man's shoulders, heaving with a grunt, the weight surprising. Both too heavy with soaked fabric and too light with wasted muscle. Slinging the man across his shoulders, Mark staggered upright, his knees bent under the awkward load, boots slipping in the churned snow. Thor moved at his side instantly, pressed against Mark's leg as though lending his own strength. Behind them the cabin groaned, a beam collapsing inward with a shriek and sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. The roar of fire seemed to chase them down the slope. Mark pushed forward, each step measured, boots punching into the snowpack. His breath was fire in his chest, his muscles screaming under the burden, but his mind was iron. He had carried bodies before, some that had gasped faintly like this one, some that never would again. Old memories clawed at him, of smoke and flame on the red mica ridge, of men who hadn't walked out. He shut them down with a single thought. Not tonight. Not this one. They reached the SUV, its roof already crowned in white. Mark swung open the rear door with one numb hand and lowered the man onto the back seat as gently as his strength allowed. Thor jumped in after, wedging his bulk along the man's legs, chest pressed to offer heat. Mark draped a foil blanket from the emergency kit over them both, the crinkle nearly drowned by the storm's howl. He slammed the door and ran around to the driver's seat, fingers fumbling against the ignition until the engine caught. The heater roared, warm air spilling weakly at first, then stronger. Mark leaned back once, eyes flicking to the rear view. The man lay slack, breath shallow, chest rising in stutters. His hands twitched once, clutching instinctively at the notebook under the parka, as though his soul refused to leave without it. Thor licked his cheek, the rough tongue scraping frost from his beard. The shepherd's ears stayed half-rotated, one eye always on. The windows, nostrils flaring, reading the night. Mark gripped the wheel, eyes scanning the darkness ahead. They weren't safe yet. Whoever had left this man to die might still be out there, watching the snow swallow evidence. He gunned the SUV forward, tires slipping once before catching. Headlights carved narrow tunnels through the storm, illuminating a world reduced to flurries and shadows. The road stretched uncertain, but he would drive it, because the man in his back seat had fought the storm to breathe, and Mark Turner would not let that struggle end here. The clinic in Mountain Hollow was little more than a converted schoolhouse, its cinder block walls painted a tired green, and its windows rattling against the push of the blizzard outside. Fluorescent lights hummed with the kind of weary determination only small-town institutions possessed. Mark Turner shouldered through the double doors with the unconscious man in his arms, his parka still wrapped tightly around him. Thor trotted at his side, fur damp, tail low but steady, amber eyes sweeping the hallway with suspicion. The building smelled of antiseptic and weak coffee, the scent of late nights and overworked staff. Behind the reception desk sat Janet Holloway, the town's only night nurse. She was in her 40s, tall and slender, her posture upright despite its fatigue. Her blonde hair, streaked with silver, was bound in a bun so tight it seemed armor against chaos. She had the angular face of someone who rarely smiled, but when she did it softened into warmth, and eyes the color of pale steel that carried both discipline and compassion. A widow who had lost her husband, a highway worker, in an avalanche 5 winters ago, Janet had learned to move through grief with purpose, pouring herself into the clinic and the patients who stumbled through its doors. She stood quickly, pulling a gurney forward. "My God, Mark! Who is he?" "Don't know yet," Mark replied, laying the man down. "Found him buried alive near the old cabin fire." Janet's eyes widened, then sharpened. She began working with brisk, decisive motions, attaching a pulse oximeter to the man's finger, slipping a thermometer beneath his arm, shining a penlight into his pupils. "Hypothermia severe. Possible frostbite. Dehydration. He's barely hanging on." Thor stationed himself beside the gurney, body angled between Daniel and the doorway, nose twitching at every new sound. The dog's stance said plainly that no one would touch the stranger without passing his judgment. Janet gave him a quick glance, lips twitching faintly. "Still as fierce as ever, Thor?" "You're a good boy." Thor's ears flicked, acknowledging but never moving his gaze from the man. As heat from blankets and IV fluids began to seep into the stranger, his body twitched, fingers curling. His lips moved, cracking with dryness, and a sound rasped out like sand over stone. Mark bent closer, his voice calm and low. "You're safe. This is Mountain Hollow Clinic. I'm Deputy Turner. Can you tell us your name?" The man stirred, eyelids struggling open. His eyes were a startling pale gray, washed out like weathered stone, but alive, alert in flickers. He drew a breath that rattled in his chest and whispered, "Cross." Daniel Cross. His voice was hoarse, guttural, as if unused for weeks, but carried a weight of memory. Janet leaned in. "Daniel, stay still. You've suffered exposure. Let the fluids work." He ignored her instruction, his trembling hand reaching toward his chest where the notebook was tucked. His fingers clawed weakly until Mark slid it into his palm. Daniel clutched it with desperate strength, holding it against his chest like a relic. Mark studied him carefully. Daniel Cross, mid-50s, but hardship had carved him older. Deep creases ran down his cheeks, beard patchy and tangled, hair hanging long over his forehead. His skin was a mosaic of scars, some thin lines from old cuts, others deeper ridges. His body spoke of once solid strength that had wasted into wiry desperation. His aura was not of madness, but of a man shaped by betrayal and loss, carrying truths too heavy to discard. His voice cracked as he spoke again, eyes glistening with fever and memory. This book, it's not just paper. It's everything they tried to bury. Names, dates, shipments. I wrote it down. I saw it." Mark leaned closer, his tone steady. "Who tried to bury it?" Daniel coughed, each shake racking his frail body, but he pushed words out through grit teeth. "The men in power. The ones who wear suits in daylight and knives at night. My father worked at Blackwell's Lodge. He found out about the shipments, chemicals, guns, bribes. They silenced him. I was there. I was just a boy, his eyes unfocused, drifting back through decades. I saw them drag him into the snow. They told me to forget or follow him. I've been running ever since." Janet paused in her work, her professional mask cracking at the raw truth in his tone. She met Mark's eyes. Mark said nothing, but the set of his jaw tightened. Thor huffed quietly, lowering his head to rest near Daniel's arm, as though anchoring the man to the present. Daniel lifted the notebook slightly, trembling. The leather cover looked like it might dissolve in his grip, but his voice steadied with the conviction of someone who had rehearsed this moment in silence for decades. Every deal they made, every number, every signature, I wrote them here. I never let it go. They hunted me for years. Tonight they tried to finish it. His eyes shifted, fear breaking through. That fire, it was them. They wanted me gone. They knew I was close. Mark glanced toward the frosted window, storm battering the glass. He spoke with deliberate calm. Daniel, you're safe here. We'll protect you. But I need you to rest. That notebook will speak when you can't. Daniel's lips twitched into a bitter smile, showing broken teeth. Safe? Number. They own the town. Your badge doesn't scare them. But maybe... His voice faded, hand tightening on the book. Maybe the truth does. His eyes closed, exhaustion dragging him under, though his grip never loosened. Janet checked the monitor. He'll sleep now. Stabilizing, but he's weak. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his short, dark hair. He looked down at Thor, who had settled into a protective crouch, ears still flicking at each sound in the hall. Watch him, Mark murmured. Thor blinked once. Slow, deliberate, before resuming his vigil. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside, the truth had surfaced at last, not in papers or reports, but in the trembling words of a forgotten man who refused to let the past stay buried. The storm had not relented by dawn. Snow pressed against the clinic windows like sheets of frosted glass, and the fluorescent lights inside hummed with stubborn resolve. Mark Turner leaned against the doorframe of the small examination room where Daniel Cross lay sleeping. The battered notebook clutched to his chest even in dreams. Thor rested on the floor near the bed, head on his paws, but his amber eyes never closed fully. Each time boots scuffed in the hallway or a door creaked, his ears pivoted, his body tense, as though he expected danger to walk through the walls themselves. Mark knew the dog's instincts were rarely wrong. The quiet was broken when the door pushed open, and Sheriff Elias Whitmore stepped inside. In his late 50s, Whitmore carried the weight of the badge like a mantle and a burden. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders but thickened by years of office work, with thinning hair slicked back, and a lined, weathered face that suggested a man long married to compromise. His mustache, once jet black, was now streaked with white, and his blue eyes had the tired sharpness of a hawk who had watched too many seasons. Known for his calm presence at community events and his stern hand during disputes, he was respected in public but whispered about in private. Years earlier, he had faced criticism for mishandling a smuggling case on the county's back roads. Some said he'd been pressured into silence by the mayor's office. Mark greeted him with a nod. Sheriff? Whitmore's eyes moved from Mark to Daniel, then to Thor, who growled low enough that it was barely audible. The sheriff held up both hands in mock surrender. Easy, boy. Just checking on our guest. He stepped closer, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. This the man you pulled out of the snow? Mark's jaw tightened. Daniel Cross. He says he's been carrying evidence for years, evidence that could bury some powerful names. Whitmore exhaled slowly, scratching at his mustache. Evidence. In a notebook? You know how that sounds, Turner. We've had drifters spin tales before Mark crossed his arms. This one almost died for it. Someone torched that cabin, Sheriff. Someone wanted him buried under snow, not breathing. Whitmore's gaze lingered on the notebook clutched in Daniel's arms. His voice softened. All right. We'll secure him, keep him safe. But for now, let's keep this quiet. No need to stir panic until we know what's inside that book. Thor stood, stepping between the sheriff and the bed. His hackles raised in a visible ridge, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Mark placed a steadying hand on the dog's neck, but didn't scold him. Thor rarely reacted this way without cause. The tension hung until another figure appeared at the doorway. Deputy Carl Jenkins. He was in his late 20s, lean and boyish, with sandy hair that always seemed 1 week past a haircut and freckles across his pale skin. His uniform was neat, but hung loose on his lanky frame, and his earnest green eyes revealed both loyalty and naivety. Jenkins was the kind of deputy who still believed the law could cure most ills, and that idealism made him both refreshing and vulnerable in a place like Mountain Hollow. He cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, I did a sweep of Cross's clothes before they thawed. Found something you should see." He held up a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a black USB drive, its casing scuffed but intact. Mark's brow furrowed. He hadn't noticed it in the snow. "Where was it?" Jenkins swallowed. "Hidden in the lining of his coat." Sewn into the hem, Daniel stirred weakly at the mention, his gray eyes flickering open for a moment. His cracked lips moved. "Don't let it disappear. They'll try." He coughed, then sank back into fevered sleep, fingers still gripping the notebook. Whitmore took the bag, turning the USB over in his palm. "Could be nothing. Could be everything. We'll log it." Thor barked once, sharp and sudden, startling everyone. His eyes fixed not on Whitmore, but on the open doorway behind him, where another figure had paused. Deputy Brent Kiley stepped inside. A broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with close-cropped dark hair and a jaw like quarried stone. He was the kind of officer who filled a room with presence whether he spoke or not. His uniform jacket hung open despite the cold, badge dangling from a lanyard instead of pinned properly, a show of carelessness or arrogance. Kiley had a reputation. He was effective in the field, fearless in confrontation, but also known for bending rules, for fixing problems the sheriff didn't want in the report. There were rumors, intimidated witnesses, paperwork gone missing, convenient accidents. Mark had never trusted him fully. Kiley's eyes flicked from the USB to Daniel, then to Thor, who growled again, louder this time. Kiley smirked. "Dog doesn't like me." Guess I shouldn't expect him to. Mark's voice was steady, but edged. "Dogs read people better than most." Kiley shrugged, stepping back. "Just came to check if our vagrant here had said anything useful." "He's a witness, not a vagrant," Mark said sharply. Whitmore raised a hand, tone even. "That's enough. Both of you. We'll handle this by the book." He slipped the USB into his coat pocket. "I'll secure this myself." Mark watched, unease tightening in his gut. Thor whined, shifting closer to Daniel again, as though the dog understood the stakes better than anyone. Later, when the sheriff and Kiley had left the room, Mark crouched by Jenkins. "Keep your eyes open. That drive doesn't leave this building unless I know where it's going. Understand?" Jenkins nodded, his youthful face set with determination. "Yes, sir." Mark straightened, resting a hand on Thor's head. The dog's amber eyes met his, unwavering. Shadows stretched long in the eye, clinic's sterile light, and Mark knew the real danger wasn't only outside in the storm. It was here, inside the walls, wearing badges and uniforms, moving unseen in the dark corridors of power. The blizzard had softened by nightfall, but the air still carried the sting of frozen knives. Snowbanks rose like white barricades on either side of the county road, and the headlights of Mark Turner's SUV carved narrow tunnels through the darkness. Inside, the heater labored against the cold, its breath barely keeping the frost from reclaiming the windshield edges. Daniel Cross sat in the back seat, swaddled in Mark's parka, his face pale beneath the tangled beard. His gray eyes flickered open and closed, always falling back to the battered notebook cradled in his hands. Beside him, Thor lay braced against the door, his body pressed into the man's side to lend warmth, ears twitching at every new sound. Mark's grip on the wheel was iron, jaw set, eyes locked on the winding road ahead. He had argued with Sheriff Whitmore for hours before deciding to move Daniel out of Mountain Hollow. Whitmore had resisted, insisting the clinic was safe, but Mark no longer trusted the walls of his own department. Too many eyes had flicked toward that USB drive, too much hunger in their glances. Now, with Jenkins' whispered promise to cover for him, Mark had slipped Daniel out under cover of storm and shadow. The snow-muted quiet fractured with a low growl from Thor. His amber eyes locked forward, body tensing, hackles rising like bristling wire. Mark leaned forward, peering through the swirl of snow, and then saw it. A dark shape sprawled across the road ahead. At first it looked like a fallen log, but the angles were wrong. A spike strip, half buried in snow. His stomach clenched. "Hold on," he barked, jerking the wheel. The SUV skidded sideways, tires crunching over ice. A split second later, the night erupted in muzzle flashes. Bullets whined against the steel frame, punching holes through sheet metal, shattering the passenger side mirror. The windshield starred, a white bloom spreading across the glass. Daniel ducked instinctively, clutching the notebook to his chest. "It's them!" His voice was hoarse, panicked but laced with grim certainty. Thor launched upright, barking so deep it rattled the interior, his body angled protectively over Daniel. Mark slammed the SUV into reverse, tires spinning, snow spraying in glittering arcs. More shots cracked, one slamming into the hood with a dull thud that shook the vehicle. The engine coughed, stuttered, then died. Steam rose from under the hood, curling into the frozen night. Mark swore, shoving the gear into park. "We're on foot." "Move." He shoved the rear door open, dragging Daniel out by the arm. Daniel stumbled, legs weak, breath ragged, but the fear in his eyes kept him moving. Thor leapt out after them, paws sinking deep into snow before he clawed forward, head low, ears pinned. Mark guided them off the road, into the cover of the trees. Bullets snapped through branches overhead, showering them with powder. Bark splintered inches from Mark's shoulder. He fired back once with his sidearm, more to buy time than hit anything. "Keep low," he shouted, half carrying Daniel through the drifts. Thor surged ahead, weaving through trees, then stopped abruptly, head lifting, nostrils flaring. He barked once, short, sharp, directional, then bounded toward a narrow gully hidden by snow-laden underbrush. Mark trusted the dog's instinct without question. He dragged Daniel into the gully, snow swallowing them to their knees. Thor whirled at the mouth of the ditch, body braced, growl rolling like thunder. In the distance, voices shouted. Men's voices, rough and commanding. One barked an order, the sound clipped by the wind. Mark pressed Daniel against the slope, shielding him with his own body. His eyes swept the tree line, scanning for movement. Shadows flickered between trunks, flashlights cutting through the storm. Whoever they were organized, moving with the practiced caution of men who had done this before. Daniel's breath came in frantic bursts. "They'll kill us!" "They won't stop." Mark's voice was a steel whisper. "Not while I'm breathing." Thor crept back, nudging Daniel with his nose before looking up at Mark, then forward again. His entire body was tense, tail stiff, ready to spring. He barked twice more, urgent, then darted uphill along the gully's edge. Mark caught the signal instantly. He's found a way out. Let's go. With Thor leading, they scrambled along the frozen ditch, branches clawing at their faces. Snow clung to Daniel's beard, his lips cracked and bleeding, but he forced himself onward, driven by survival and the notebook's weight. Mark fired another shot over his shoulder, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating masked figures advancing through the trees. Thor paused at a break in the ridge, barking sharply. He bounded up, disappearing into the pines above. Mark pushed Daniel ahead, boosting him up the incline before hauling himself after. Bullets shredded branches below, but the attackers hesitated at the open slope, unwilling to cross under fire. At the top, Thor waited, chest heaving, snow caked in his fur. He gave a low whine, then nudged them toward a narrow deer path winding deeper into the forest. Mark didn't hesitate. They plunged into the trail, the dog leading, Daniel stumbling but clinging to his notebook like a lifeline. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter, swallowed by the storm. They didn't stop until the forest thickened, and the sounds of pursuit faded entirely. Mark pressed Daniel down against a fallen log, chest heaving, frost clinging to his beard. Thor circled once, then stood guard at the edge of the clearing, ears swiveling constantly. Mark crouched beside Daniel, voice low but steady. "You're still breathing." "That's more than they wanted." Daniel coughed, his breath rattling, but his eyes burned with stubborn fire. "They won't stop, Deputy." "Not until I'm gone and this book is ash." He patted the notebook weakly. "But I won't let them have it." "Not again." Mark laid a hand on his shoulder, firm, grounding. "Then we keep moving." Thor will see us through Thor's amber eyes, flicked back towards them, steady and unblinking, as if the dog understood every word. In the silence of the snowbound forest, the three of them had become something fragile but unbreakable. A man, a witness, and a dog, bound together against the dark. The forest swallowed sound as the three fugitives trudged through snowbound pines, their breaths coming in ragged bursts. Mark Turner kept his hand firm on Daniel Cross's arm, half guiding and half dragging him up the slope. Thor padded ahead, his black and sable coat frosted white, ears flicking constantly, every step measured with the instinct of an animal bred to lead men out of darkness. The storm had thinned to a whisper, but the cold was relentless, turning sweat into ice along Mark's spine and frosting Daniel's beard into stiff needles. They stumbled into a clearing where an old fire road split off toward a rise. Thor stopped, nose high, tail stiff, then bounded toward the slope as if he knew what lay beyond. Mark followed, squinting against the wind until the outline of a cabin emerged through the blur of snow. A squat structure of logs and stone, roof sagging under decades of neglect. Its shutters hung crooked, and the door leaned from its hinges, but it was shelter. Mark pushed Daniel forward. "Cabin." "Move inside." The air was stale but dry. Dust and cobwebs blanketed every surface. The hearth yawned black, ashes long cold. Mark set Daniel on a creaking cot against the wall, while Thor circled the one-room space, sniffing corners, then settling near the door like a sentinel. Mark found a box of old firewood stacked beneath a warped table, likely left by a ranger years ago. With clumsy fingers he built a fire, coaxing sparks until flames licked upward, painting the room in gold. The warmth spread slowly, enough to push the cold back from their bones. Daniel slumped against the wall, his gaunt frame trembling under the parka. Firelight revealed more of his features, deep-set eyes ringed by shadows, nose crooked from an old break, cheekbones sharp from hunger. His beard, once dark, was streaked heavily with gray, and a scar crossed his jawline, faded but unmistakable. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravel of too many winters, yet the words came clear. "I wasn't always like this," he said, staring into the fire. I had a family once. A wife named Marjorie. Hair red as autumn leaves, skin pale as the first snow. She laughed at everything, even my worst jokes. We had a boy, Eli. Bright-eyed, curious. He used to follow me into the yard with toy hammers, saying he'd build houses better than mine someday. Mark listened in silence, sensing the weight behind every syllable. I worked construction back then. Honest work, long days, but it kept food on the table. Until I saw something I shouldn't. Contracts coming through that didn't add up. Payments funneled through shell companies tied to Blackwell and his circle. I asked questions, thought honesty mattered. Daniel laughed bitterly. That's when everything started to rot. He shifted, pulling the notebook into his lap. His hand shook as he traced the cracked leather cover. They came for me at night. First, I lost the job. Then, threats, notes, slipped under the door. Marjorie begged me to stop, but I couldn't. One evening I came home to silence. No laughter, no toys, just emptiness. They'd taken them. My family vanished. Some say they fled. I know better. They silenced them to punish me, to make me watch everything crumble. Mark clenched his fists, anger simmering. Thor raised his head, sensing the tension, then lowered it again, his eyes softening as though he understood the pain in Daniel's voice. I ran, Daniel continued. Not because I wanted to live, but because I thought maybe, just maybe, I could gather enough truth to strike back. I collected scraps, receipts, whispers, ledgers. This notebook is my coffin and my weapon. It's why they hunt me, why they'd rather bury me in snow than see me speak. Mark reached across, steadying his trembling hand. You're not alone now. They'll have to get through us. Daniel looked at him, eyes shining wet in the firelight. You don't know how deep it goes. Men you trust wear two faces. Even your badge can't protect you when the rot is inside the wood. Before Mark could answer, Thor stirred. The shepherd padded to a corner where floorboards sagged. He sniffed, then pawed, claws scraping wood. Mark stood, curious, and pulled back the rotted planks. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a tin box. Inside, preserved against time, were documents yellowed with age, faded photos, handwritten ledgers, and a silver key tied to a strip of leather. Daniel's breath hitched when he saw it. He reached trembling fingers for the key, clutching it as if it were his son's hand. My father left this, he whispered. He worked here as a ranger before they killed him. He said if anything ever happened, the truth would be hidden where the mountains still listened. Tears traced lines through the grime on his face. He believed someone would find it. After all these years, it's me Mark sifted through the papers. One ledger detailed shipments marked with coded initials, dates stretching back decades. Another page listed payments to names Mark recognized. Officials, contractors, even lawmen. He felt a chill deeper than the storm outside. Daniel leaned back, exhausted, but a faint spark of peace glimmered in his eyes. Maybe I wasn't running for nothing. Maybe they didn't die in vain. The fire crackled. Thor returned to the door, curling into a silent guard position, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight. For the first time in years, Daniel Cross allowed himself to rest without fear. Fate had bound him to a deputy hardened by fire, and a dog whose loyalty burned brighter than any badge, the morning sky over Mountain Hollow bruised with heavy clouds, the kind that carried both snow and reckoning. Mark Turner stood outside the cabin, his breath visible in the sharp air, while Thor prowled the clearing, his tail stiff, nostrils flaring for scents that didn't belong. Inside, Daniel Cross sat hunched by the fire, the notebook and the tin box from his father spread across the table like relics on an altar. His hands, scarred and shaking, traced every page as if to remind himself that these truths had survived as stubbornly as he had. Mark had made his decision during the night. They couldn't keep running. The storm had hidden them for a time, but the evidence in their possession was too powerful to bury again. There was one contact outside of Mountain Hollow he trusted. Special Agent Dana Green of the FBI, a woman he had worked with years ago during a border smuggling case. She was unflinching, with the kind of steel resolve that could burn through corruption. By mid-morning, a convoy of black SUVs wound into the valley, snow crunching under their tires. The FBI agents disembarked in practiced formation, their winter gear heavy but neat, weapons held discreetly. Leading them was Dana Green herself. In her late 30s, she was a striking woman with olive-toned skin and dark hair drawn into a knot at her neck. Her eyes, a sharp hazel, missed nothing. She carried herself with quiet authority, her stance balanced like a fighter who knew how to finish what she started. She shook Mark's hand firmly. "You picked a dangerous game, Turner. But if what you say is true, it's worth the risk." Mark gestured toward Daniel, who stood with his shoulders straighter than they had been in years. His eyes still carried weariness, but behind them flickered a light that had been missing. "This is Daniel Cross. He's kept their crimes alive on scraps of paper and ink, and he nearly died for it." Daniel extended the notebook, his voice gravelly but resolute. "I won't run anymore. This is everything they've built their empire on: shipments, bribes, murder." "It's time someone listened." Green nodded once, her jaw tightening. "Then let's bring the mountain down on them." The plan was swift. That evening, in a gravel quarry on the edge of town, Daniel would make a trade under FBI surveillance, offering the notebook and the hidden USB to Blackwell's men. Mark and Thor would stay close, eyes on the shadows, while agents sealed the perimeter. The hours until dusk were taut, each moment stretched thin. Daniel prepared himself in silence, combing fingers through his ragged beard, pulling Mark's parka tighter around his wasted frame. He looked older than his years, but his posture no longer slouched. Thor watched him constantly, sometimes resting his great head on Daniel's knee, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. When the sun bled out behind the ridges, the quarry became a stage. Frost glittered on the gravel piles. Spotlights were killed, engines silenced. Daniel walked forward with trembling legs, clutching the battered notebook in one hand, the USB in the other. A group of men emerged from the far side, dark coats, hoods up, movements practiced. At their center walked Richard Blackwell, the town's untouchable king. In his 60s, he was tall, barrel-chested, his silver hair combed back with oil. His face was carved with arrogance, cheeks ruddy from years of bourbon and power. His eyes, sharp blue and cold as lake ice, swept the scene like a predator surveying prey. He wore a tailored overcoat, absurd in the snow, and carried no weapon in sight. Men like him never needed one when others bared theirs. Blackwell's smile was slow and cruel. "Cross, alive after all. I told them you were a stubborn weed." Daniel's grip tightened on the notebook. "You buried my father. You took my family. You thought you'd silence me, but the snow doesn't keep secrets forever." Blackwell chuckled, the sound like gravel in a barrel. "A bitter old vagrant thinks he'll undo decades of empire with paper and ink? You should have stayed underground." He extended a gloved hand. "Hand it over, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." Daniel's legs trembled, but his voice did not. "No. Tonight, you answer for it." The signal came from Thor. Hidden among the gravel piles, he loosed a bark. Deep, commanding, a thunderclap in canine form. At once, floodlights roared alive, cutting through the dark. FBI agents surged from cover, weapons raised, voices booming commands. Blackwell's men reached for guns, but Thor was faster, charging with explosive speed. He bowled one man to the ground, teeth flashing, buying seconds that allowed the agents to disarm the rest. Mark sprinted from the shadows, weapon leveled. His voice cracked like ice breaking. "Richard Blackwell, you're under arrest!" The old tycoon's face hardened, his mask slipping into fury. "You'll regret this, Turner. You think the FBI will keep the wolves at bay? I own this town." Dana Green stepped forward, her voice cutting the night. "Not anymore." She held up the USB. "You owned it. But this ends now." The takedown was brutal but swift. Blackwell was shoved against a vehicle, his shouts echoing in the quarry. His men were cuffed, evidence bags filled with cash-stained ledgers and weapons hidden in crates. Daniel stood rooted, breath fogging the air, disbelief and relief warring on his face. When Thor returned to his side, panting, snow clinging to his fur, Daniel knelt and pressed a trembling hand to the dog's head. His eyes brimmed with tears. "You saved me. You saved everything." The next morning, Mountain Hollow awoke to convoys of FBI vehicles and the sound of doors crashing open across town. Warehouses raided, offices seized, politicians in suits led out in handcuffs, their faces pale in the morning light. News crews captured it all, broadcasting the downfall of men once thought untouchable. At a press conference, Agent Green stood before cameras and microphones. Behind her, Mark and Thor waited, the deputy in his worn uniform, the dog wearing a fresh harness gleaming black. Daniel stood with them, no longer just a vagrant, but a witness whose words carried weight. Green's voice was steady. "Today, thanks to the bravery of Deputy Turner, his K-9 partner Thor, and the testimony of Daniel Cross, we have dismantled a network of corruption that poisoned this town for decades. Justice has returned to Mountain Hollow." Applause followed, echoing across the square. Mark bowed his head slightly, then gestured toward Thor. The crowd erupted louder as the shepherd lifted his head, eyes gleaming amber in the light. Daniel, frail but unbowed, whispered into the cold morning air. "They thought God had forgotten me. But he sent me a dog and a deputy." He stood straighter, his voice steadier. "Maybe faith was all I needed to keep walking." In that moment, Mark knew the storm had broken, not the snowstorm. That would come again, but the storm of silence and fear that had ruled their town. And in its place, justice stood, fragile but radiant as dawn. In the frozen nights, when despair seems to swallow everything, miracles do not always appear as lightning from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in the loyalty of a dog, in the courage of an officer who refuses to give up, in the endurance of a forgotten man who clings to the truth. These are the ways God shows us that He has never abandoned us, even when we wander through the darkest valleys. The story of Daniel Cross, Mark Turner, and Thor reminds us that justice and faith always endure for those who dare to hold on. In our daily lives, we may face struggles, loss, or injustice of our own. Yet if we keep honesty, love, and trust in God alive, He will send us our miracle, perhaps in the form of a person, an opportunity, or a helping hand at just the right moment. If this story touched your heart, share it so others may also find inspiration. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories, and may God bless everyone watching with strength, hope, and light.